Good morning, everybody. If you would, please take a second, put down your sandwiches. Please rise, take off your hats, and let's have an invocation. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this day and all the blessings you've given us. We thank you for this marvelous country you've allowed us to live in, and we ask you to protect us and all the people who protect this country in the armed services. We pray that you will bless this food and this food to our bodies and our bodies to your service. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. Amen. We'll now have Larry Head with the pledge and the national anthem.
Please join me for the pledge.
Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now we're going to sing the national anthem. Please feel free to join in. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Testing. Good morning. Thank you again for coming. Appreciate it. We have some extra lunches. Don't take the second one until you make sure everybody got one. A few announcements before we have our main speaker, Dr. John Bizal, talk about planes during World War II. He's an excellent speaker, and you will really enjoy it. We have Santa's Trains and Planes, and that is December 8, 2024. Bring your grandkids, your children, if they're, of Santa Claus age. If they want to get on his knee. But we have that on December 8th from 12 to 4. It's very successful. There'll be coloring books, other things they can goof off with, and we have a Santa on stage with 2 big trees. So that's a Sunday, December 8th. 2024. Remember, that's when we went to war in 1941. Okay, the 3 announcements I had, that's one announcement. The 3 other ones, all this stuff is moving to the Evidence of Wartime Museum. Our roof is fixed. You won't get wet. You won't get any snow on you if you are inside. Now, outside, I can't guarantee anything. So we'd like you all to attend. We're going to have Mission Barbecue or Chick-fil-A or something else. So the dietary things will change a little bit. There are no steaks that day, though. So that'll be the 5th, the 12th, and the 19th. On the 5th, we have a Judge Sweeney coming down from Indianapolis to talk. He was the first pilot over enemy territory during the Persian Gulf War. I was in the Persian Gulf War. It was early January of 1991 and late 90. The second speaker is on December 12th, and I want you at the museum that day. We're having according to Bruce Green, he's one of 2 pilots left that flew a P-47 in World War II. I think he might be the last one, but there's 1 or 2 living, and we're going to have an interview. So you think of your questions of what to ask, and I will be sitting in his living room, and he will talk about his experiences for about a half an hour to 45 minutes, and then you will ask your questions back and forth. We're going to talk about, he flew in Germany near Leipzig, and he grew up in St. Joe, Missouri, and he has a heck of a CV. He was worked for NASA for only 30 years afterwards, and he finished his 10th book at age 99, and I recommend you reading it. He's a writer, and so he's with the program. The last talk is December 19th. Remember, we're not skipping that Thursday. December 19th is the last talk in December, and that's going to be by a teacher named Glenn Foster. He's coming from Virginia to talk, but he's going to talk about a man that was a guerrilla in World War II in the Philippines. He was near the Bataan March and got out, got loose, and got free. And so he was what you call a guerrilla for the United States in World War II. His family got a telegram in 1943, said he was dead because they couldn't find him for 2 years. And all of a sudden he showed up. I couldn't survive in that jungle for about 10 minutes, and he survived for 2 years. I doubt if many of you could survive either, but he's going to talk about this man, and it's we haven't talked about the Philippines much, but it's, and people hear the Bataan March, and we have a display at our museum about the nurses that were there. There were close to 70 military nurses in the Bataan March area, and many of them survived. Now, today's talk is by John Bizal. Dr. Bizal has been a practitioner here for many, many years. His son is John C. Bizal, so if you need your ears fixed, go to John C. Bizal. He's excellent as well, but John Sr. is right here, and he doesn't work anymore in regards to doctoring, but he's a Rose-Hulman graduate, and I can't talk about him. It'd take me an hour to talk about things he's done, but he's a Mr. Collector of all kinds of artifacts. His garage is bigger than this room, and his wife tolerates it. Debbie says it's okay, and he's got all kinds of memorabilia. He and his dad were big collectors. If you look at those patches on the wall, those are all his. He gave us those are only 5 out of the 23 he gave us. And so we have those displayed all around the city, and we will rotate them so other places see it. Him and his dad had that as a hobby, and it's probably one of the bigger collections in the United States. Patches that the military guys would wear on their arm there. Okay, so think about what he's saying. Ask questions afterward. It's going to be an excellent talk. Okay, John Bizal.
Welcome to fall. Before we start, what do you think you have if you cross a centipede into turkey? You have a drumstick for everybody. Now, before I get into the talk itself, I want to give you a couple disclaimers. I was not in World War II. I was only 10. And I didn't fly any combat missions. But I do have some qualifications and certificates about these 2 planes, and I have owned and flown both of these for more than 25 years, and I have over 500 hours in each of them, and probably a total of 1,500 landings. And my landings are equal to my takeoffs.
Well, I would hope so.
I have to apologize if I read some of it. I'm just trying to avoid a Biden moment, hunting for the right words. But this is the first plane we're going to talk about. It's an A-75 Stearman. Now, I've had that plane for 25 some years. And the government, while I did not fly this airplane in the military, the government did help me in my flying, because in 1962 and 63, through the GI Bill for service in 58, 1959, I did get a pilot's license and instrument rating. Later on, I acquired both a glider and a seaplane rating and a commercial pilot certificate. I have been rated as both a wingman and a lead pilot for formation flying, and have done that for about 20 years. I also have been a pilot, solo pilot in command of more than 24 types and makes of airplanes. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you, even though I didn't learn it in the military, I knew what they taught them, and I tried to sort of follow along on a private basis. Recently, several years ago, I received the Wright Brothers Safe Pilot for 50 Years Award, and I think that probably Bruce Ettmeyer, who's here, and I are the only pilots in the area with the Wright Brothers Awards. I apologize if I sometimes read what I'm going to say, but as I say, that's to come up with the right words at the right time. Well, this is the A-75 here on the ground, and there it is in the air. This is the North American AT-6 Advanced Trainer. It had 3 machine guns, one on the right wing, one firing through the propeller, and the rear seat was where a gunner with a swivel gun could sit. And it was nicknamed the pilot trainer because if you could fly it, it's been said that you could pretty much fly anything in those years that the military had. These airplanes received, however, neither the acclaim or the glory nor the press that other military planes did. But they did allow our forces to go from the bottom of the list as far as availability and preparedness to the top, and that made possible the winning of the Air War, and second to that, the World War II. The Stearman, or Yellow Peril, as it was called by the Navy, was the first plane met by cadets and was the first plane designed to be a primary trainer. It was purpose-built. It was built for a mission to quickly, efficiently, and completely train the best pilots in the world in every aspect of aviation. All cadets were volunteers. None were drafted. Many had never seen an airplane or even been in an airplane at that time. Few of us remember. I know there are a few of you that will, but the period of 1938 to 1940, before the war. I don't remember much in that period. I was only 5. But that's why we start school at 6, when the brain can begin to assimilate various things and retain some of it. Remember that in 1938, that was only 20 years after the end of World War I. And most Americans were tired of war. They were, in fact, isolationists. Their feeling was, let Europe fight Europe wars, let South America fight South America's wars. But in 1939, Germany invaded France, Austria, and the Low Countries. The British, even the ground troops, came to Europe to fight with the French because of a shared protection agreement. The French seemed to hide under the beds, however. In 1940, the Germans bombed England almost every night that the moon was out that they could see. Winston Churchill continuously asked President Roosevelt for help. He wanted destroyers, he wanted artillery, he wanted airplane engines. But the Congress continually said no and no. Remember that one of the things that all politicians seem to, their primary goal is to get reelected. And thinking of getting reelected, a lot of the people in the United States wanted us to be neutral. They didn't want us to get into it. So Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt planned, and along with General Marshall, came up with a plan called Lend-Lease. To remain neutral, we couldn't sell to England, we couldn't even give to England, or we would be in the war. So they developed a program of furnishing the items on lending, and at the end of the war, when they were no longer used, they could be returned, and if they on a lease agreement. And of course, the major people who received this were England and Russia. But in 1940, at one of President Roosevelt's early fireside talks, he said he was going to beef up the military and the next year build 55,000 airplanes. Well, at that time, we didn't have 55,000 pilots. And those that we did have were flying basically substandard airplanes. Germany led the pack. The Stearman and the T6 were a big part of that 55,000. To get pilots, the college degree was waived as a requirement, as was high school, but not the equivalency. But these young boys, young men, fresh off the farm, out of the factory, or just out of school, were all volunteers. Over the next 4 years, 190,000 of them were commissioned pilots. There was another 130,000 that didn't make it through. Now that didn't mean they weren't just as smart as the others, but they just couldn't put together all the facts as quickly as was necessary to quickly turn out pilots in less than a year. And they then transferred either to other services or became crewmen or mechanics. You had a lot better choice if you volunteered than if you were drafted. The cadets studied physics, aerodynamics, navigation, map reading, weather, and not the least, military function and military discipline. This was all strange to those young men in 1940. The requests went out for training planes, and Stearman came through with a good plan. Everybody liked it, but they said it was too easy to fly because they didn't want an easy plane to fly. they wanted the pilots to learn through the principles of aerodynamics and be able to make the plane do what you wanted it to do, not the plane telling you what it wanted to do. So what they redesigned the Stearman. What they did was they narrowed the landing gear. Next time you're at the museum, look at the landing gear on the Stearman and compare it to what's on the P-47. They also put the fuel in the upper wing, right in the middle. And this narrowed its center of gravity and made it more unstable. If you look at the plans of the fuselage, you will find that they're not mirror images. The right side doesn't is not just a mirror image of the left side. If you went through the air, it was going to fly itself. And if you wanted it to do something, you had to do it with your hands and your feet. Wrong button. Another T6. This is the insignia that the cadets wore in all branches. Now here is the control panel on a Stearman. Look at this big number of instruments around there. I gotta go backwards here. You can, I've got to use both hands just like the pilots. There aren't many instruments right there, and the only navigation instrument was this one and the compass. Everything else was an engine instrument, which allowed you to see what was going on. This is the instrument panel in the P-47. And you can see how complicated that is with all the gauges and switches and everything that the pilot then needed to use. I talked with the pilot that flew the P-47 up, and we were talking about airplanes and how difficult or easy it was to fly one or the other. And what plane do you think he thought was harder to fly? He says, the P-47 is stable. It's heavy, it's big, huge landing gear, maybe 15 feet. He says what they should have done was start the pilots and start the cadets in the P-47 and then let them work up to the Stearman. Now, there are four forces that work on an airplane, basically. You have lift, and that's the most important. You have thrust, and that pulls you forward. You have drag, and that slows you down. That's everything that sticks into the wind. And then you have gravity going down. Now, if there's a disagreement between any of those other forces, bet on gravity, because it's going to win. The most important is lift. And this is a wing rib, and here is a wing rib from a earlier airplane, not the Stearman. And when you space them out in the wing, they form an airfoil. No matter if they're covered with canvas or linen or aluminum or even a very thin wood. You can see that the top here is longer than the bottom. So when this hits air molecules, this upper molecule has to go farther than the one on the bottom, which easily just slips right along the bottom. Well, as it's going across this top, it gets shoved up out of the airflow. And so all this space back in here, there's no air. And what is there if there's no air? There's a vacuum. And that vacuum pulls the wing up, which is lift. And that's why an airplane flies. If you just would shove a square piece of wood through, gravity's going to win. It's not going to go anywhere. But with a big surface with a space from here back, this is all lift area right in here. Now, this lift has to be controlled with the thrust. The thrust is created by the propeller and the engine running the propeller. It screws its way forward, and basically that also is an airfoil, except in this different shape. It's not just a square blade of like a knife, and it gives you thrust. Anything that hangs out, including the tail, creates drag. These wheels are drag. The fuselage is drag. The gotta go backwards here. The other thing that these controls do is a car can go this way or this way and turn this way or this way. But the airplane has another axis. It can go up and it can go down. And they're controlled by both hands and both feet and your eyes and the seat of your pants. And they have to be put together in the correct way in order to fly the airplane. The engine and propeller and mixture in the Stearman is in a quadrant over with your left hand, and that provides the thrust to pull you. The elevator back here on the back of the airplane controls up and down. If the elevator is down, like it is here, the wind is going to hit it from the bottom. What's it going to do? Push the tail up and down you go. If you and this is controlled by the stick. You pull back to go up. That goes down with cables and pulleys, and the nose will go up. And the opposite is true if you want to go the other way. If you want to go down, you push on the stick, and the elevator would be up, catch the wind, and push the tail down, and then you would go there. Now, this is the rudder, and it is controlled with your feet. If you want to turn left, and that is a flat turn, if you want to turn left, push the stick to the left, and the rudder will move to the left. The wind will hit that. The wind will hit this, it's over to the left side, and move the tail to the right, and then you turn left. The last control is the ailerons. There's rudder left, there's aileron down. So with this configuration, you'd be diving to the left. The last control is the ailerons. And these are little strips on the outer edges of the wings. And they work opposite. One goes up, one goes down. The one that is up, like this one, is going to create drag. And so the air is going to push it down. The one on the other wing is going to be down, and it's going to create more lift, so that plane will raise up and bank to the right. Now, the airplanes were painted different colors by different services. These are all Navy planes. They were yellow. The Army had blue bodies, blue fuselages, and yellow tails. And later on, the Army Air Corps had silver ones, and there's a few of them there. Now, one of the things that occurred in the cockpit, the pilot, the instructor sat in the back, the student sat in the front, and there was very little communication between them, except it went one way. It went from the instructor to the pilot. The Stearmans did not have an electrical system, and they didn't have electric start. So in the front seat, the student would put these earphones into his helmet, and in the back seat, they would pass it underneath. In the back, the instructor would be telling him what to do. Student couldn't talk back. That was just one of the ways it went, sort of from the top down always. The other thing that the Stearman didn't have was a starter. That's not quite right. It didn't have an electric starter. What it had was a crank on the side, the left side of the engine up front, where a crank was cranked around, tightening a spring, just like a grandfather clock, except it was much bigger and stronger. And it was hard to crank. But it was an impulse starter, so they would wind it up, and then the cadet, when ready, would signal him, and he would release it, and the cadet hoped he had everything set right as far as mixture and throttle, and had primed the engine, pumped a little fuel into each cylinder before he did that, so that when the crewman released it, the engine would fire and he would be able to keep it running. if he couldn't do it, he didn't endure himself to the crew because they were hard to crank. One of the things that they learned in training was navigation. Now, how many of you think that north on a map is north on a compass? Well, you're ahead there because it's not. North is a big iron deposit off to the southeast of the North Pole. It's in Canada. And so the compass points to it. It doesn't point to the top of a globe or the top of our Earth. And right where we are now in Indiana, we're pretty much under the north, under the magnetic north. We're just 2 degrees off. So if you flew the compass from here to Terre Haute, you'd get there. But if you were in San Francisco and you wanted to go to Seattle, which on the map is directly north, you'd never make it. You'd be out in the middle of Washington State, out to the east. It is 12 degrees off. So this was one of the big things, navigation, for those primary students, because they may have been know how to read a road map, but trying to get from one place to the other was a difficult problem. The other way that they learned, now right now in the primary, they were learning about these things, but they weren't actually doing them because, remember, no electrical system in the Stearman. This is a board game from the 30s and 40s called Flying the Beam. And a radio station, either on an airfield or at another location, emitted sounds in quadrants. First, these sounds were sent down a certain azimuth. Say if you were right here and we're going backwards, to fly to that, if you were going straight up, that'd be north. To the left, in that quadrant, right here, would be an A, right there, from there to here. And an A in Morse code is dot dash, dot dash, dot dash. Over on the right side of that beam would be an N, and an N is dash dot, dash dot, dash dot. In the center of the beam, it would be a steady sound. So let's just take this one right here, probably about 220 degrees. If you were flying toward it and you came across dash dot, you knew you were right here. If you were flying in this area and came across dot dash, you knew you were over here on the right side of the center line between the beams. Now, how would you know? You would know that you were left of the beam if it was going dot dash, but you still didn't know where you were, because you could be here or you could be here. And if you turned from where you were about 90 degrees until you got a solid sound, you still didn't know if you were going toward it or reverse or away from it. And that was judged by loudness. If it got louder, you're going toward the station. If it didn't, you're going away from it. You did a 180 and went back the other way. And this, again, was difficult to work on and quickly work on. You couldn't panic. I mean, this had to be done with all kinds of not only flying lessons, but thinking lessons. And this is another reason that some of the planes, some of the cadets just couldn't quite grasp everything in time. After about 2 to 3 months doing all the book work, and the main thing that they got out of the training in the Stearman was how to solo it, how to, on your own, take it off, fly around in a circle or a racetrack and land it. And they did that over and over and over and over. And it was usually in a field, either a quarter to a half a mile square, and grass, because grass would be more forgiving, but they always tried to land into the wind. And they always had a tetrahedron, or a pointed windsock, more or less, on the corner of the field, so the cadets could, with that grass field, and everybody flying at that time would be doing the same thing. It would just be a multiple pattern of going around and going around and landing. And in landing, you had 2 choices. You could land on the wheels, which is more advanced, but you learned to land 3-point, just above the stall. Now, we talked about lift, and what is a stall? A stall has nothing to do with the engine running. That's not a stall. A stall is loss of lift. So if you were flying and you put your wing way up like this, the air up here would be blocked that was previously going, and this air down here would just be turbulent, and you would lose lift and gravity would win again. But if you're going in a straight line, if both wings doing the same, you could settle in and hit on 3 points just before you had lost all lift and you went clunk. But the Stearman was tough. You could do that. And I mean, you could drop it in, the saying is, and it isn't going to break. But that was all done on non-paved areas. Paved was more difficult because if you hit the runway like this, very quickly you're going to go on 2 wheels. On grass, you could slide. The grass would give. It would be about the same. A baseball player can slide into second base, either straight or even sideways, and survive, but you can't slide on concrete very well. The next airplane, after you learn to land and take off, is this one. And this is a basic trainer. It's a BT-13 made by Vultee. It was often called the Vultee vibrator. It was much advanced from the Stearman because It had it had fixed landing gear, but it had a more powerful engine, 450 horsepower. They could talk to each other because it was electric. It had electric start, and it also had an intercommunication between the pilot in here was up front, and in the rear was the instructor. In the Stearman, until they got to solo, the instructor was in the pilot seat in the rear, and the student was in the front. And in this airplane, they learned the basics of all those other problems that they were to study. After they had been with the program there for another several months, they were promoted and they went to the T6 right here. And this was basically the fun part of the flying. It was the hot rod. It was nimble. You could do aerobatics. You could go cross country. You could do formation flying. You learned gunnery, navigation, and this was called the pilot maker, because as I mentioned earlier, if you could fly this, you probably could fly the next step, which would be frontline aircraft. One of the main things that in hints on how to fly a T6 was basically don't stall, and don't stall. That means don't lose lift. If you're at altitude, that's fine, because you recover from a stall by lowering the nose, getting the wings level, and picking up airspeed. And then again, you've got that vacuum back here. But if you're going either sideways or the angle of attack is too high, you're going to lose that vacuum, you're going to lose lift, and gravity wins again. So in a T6, though, it's much sleeker, and if you're coming in for a landing on this table, and you go over here too far, what do you do to try to get back? You might push the left rudder, and now you could slide back, but in doing so, you're losing lift on the wing. And if you're going at a slow speed, that wing is going to stall, and gravity's going to win again, and you don't have time to recover. The same thing if you undershoot it. You didn't line up correctly, and you want to push rudder. Now, you could do it if you also move the ailerons, but then you might be too close to the ground, and if you were, the wing would hit and cause you difficulty too. So the big thing on a T6, don't stall it at low altitudes. And that again it's the definition of the stall. It's too wordy to say loss of lift every time, and so it's called a stall. But it really doesn't mean an engine's faulty. Your engine's running, and you can lose lift in any position at any speed if you block that area of lift that's built into the airplane. The T6 is a good formation trainer. And here's a formation of T6s. And when you're flying formation, the only thing that this pilot is doing is looking at the next plane, and they're just holding that plane steady by keeping two objects in a direct line. And the T6 is powerful enough that it's easy to move in closely or to the outside. One thing though that you don't do in formation flying is go wing up. You don't bank significantly. You can slide in a T6, but here you're going at speed and you're not going to stall. These are formations for to a flight. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and the tails number 4. That's a diamond. The diamond is the basic flight of 4. The biggest flight I've been in was a flight of 50 in 2008. It was the T6's 70th year, and we made a big 7 and a 0 and had 2 diamonds of diamonds. That's 16 each. And we flew at the Oshkosh Air Show and the Lakeland Air Show in the spring. And it's work because you are constantly looking at the other plane. Now, after this part of your training would probably last another 3 or 4 months, and then you would graduate and go either, here's just another formation of T6s of the air show group Air Shell. You would either go to a FM2, a Wildcat, or a P-40, a Curtiss Hawk, or to a P-39 Bel Air Cobra. That would be your next step. They're all single pilot planes, and so there was no instructor training period. You basically learned how everything worked on the airplane, the gears, the flaps, the engine, and then you flew it. The T6 was also a very active plane in Korea, and it was called the Mosquito, and the North Koreans and Chinese named it the Mosquito because when you heard it, they knew that very shortly after that they're going to get some bigger planes, either Corsairs or P-51s or F-84 Thunder Chiefs jets that were going to rocket them or bomb them. And they were going too fast, though, to pick out the targets. So the T6 were forward air control. They carried rockets under the wings and but yet were fast enough and nimble enough that they didn't get too much ground fire. But they would fly over, and if they saw something that should be destroyed, fire a WP rocket. That's white phosphorus, or Willie Peter Willie Pete rockets. And then coming right after them would be the faster airplanes, which were circling above, waiting for that white smoke from the Willie Pete rocket. And then they would go in with the bigger ordnance. The nickname of this painting is Out on a Limb. And that was because in Korea, there wasn't any permanent base for these planes. If you remember when the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, which separated north from south, they pushed the Allies all the way back to the Pusan perimeter in the southeastern quadrant. So the front line was constantly moving. Then MacArthur did the invasion at Incheon, and backwards it went. And the Allies went all the way up to China. And so that was movement all the way back. And so every day, these guys were moving their home base. And then the Chinese came across the river, and back they went south again, down and held there at the 38th parallel. But the T-6 was a big plane in doing this. And this is the color of the T-6 in action. This is me and Bill Sperling on our way up to Oshkosh, going by Chicago. Here's me welcoming, more or less, the LST coming down the Ohio. This is an unusual picture because this airfield, that's going by Chicago. This is Meigs Field, which, if you remember, Mayor Daley, about 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, decided he wanted to use that airfield for something else, and overnight he sent bulldozers down without telling anybody. All the not commercial jets, but business jets and everything were trapped in that airfield till they got temporary repairs to get them out of there, and he closed the airport with no orders to do so, but he pretty much ran Chicago at that time. The WWII flew T-6s to either transport them or transport somebody else without having to get the active duty pilots. These are WASP, W-A-S-P, Women's Air Service Pilots. And that's us up at Vincennes at the museum for one of their celebration days. Now, in summary, then, from August the 1st, the U.S. built 300,000 aircraft. Of these, 69,000 were for the Navy. And this is the Lend-Lease got 69,000 airplanes from us. And this is what England made, Germany, Japan. And back at that time, we had made 15,500 P-47s at $85,000 each. Now $5 million. The U.S. produced 193,000 pilots. For each man in combat, there were 16 to support them, and 4 ground crew helped each man who flew. The biggest mission of the war was the 24th of December, 1944, and there were 2,046 planes in that day go to Germany to bomb or fight. They didn't all come from the same place. They came from England, came from France, came from northern Italy, and they came from the north. Overall, 68,000 airmen died, and there were more pilots and crew that died in training and accidents than from enemy action. Well, we've got, and that pretty much concludes what I was going to say about the Stearmans and the T6s. But I've got a good story to tell you. Then it's true and can be truth checked. And it's about the Stearman and the hump. Do you know what the hump is? The hump is the Himalayan mountains which separate China from India, going through Burma. No cowards fly the hump in Stearmans. Now the humps are, that's where Mount Everest is, the tallest mountain. But these peaks were 24,000 feet, 22,000 feet, and they cross Burma in this area here. Well, I keep getting the wrong button here. They cross Burma into China, right here, into Kunming. And you may have heard of the Burma Road. This was a road that connected India and Burma. Very mountainous, but horsetail after horsetail after horsetail turns to go to China. Well, the Japanese captured it in 42. The only way that supplies could go from India to China was by flying them in the hump. That's called flying the hump. And this was done in P-47s and P-46s, carrying all kind of supplies to the Chinese. Well, in 1940, this gentleman, Wing Commander Watts of the British Air Training Plan, was placed in charge of pilot training in Western Canada in Lend-Lease T6s. They had 100 Stearman. And the weather and the training, this was when England was really short of pilots in the Battle of Great Britain. But the weather and the Stearmans didn't get along very well, and training in an open cockpit didn't go, so they moved the whole enterprise over to India. Wing Commander Watts went, and that would be a colonel, our equivalent of a colonel. Wing Commander Watts went back to Europe, flew and fought there until the European War was over. When the European War was over, he was sent to Lahore, where the training base had a bunch of Stearmans, and Wing Commander Watts found that many of them were the same airplanes that he had commanded back in 1940, 5 years earlier in Canada. But he was, at that time, he was doing desk work, working paperwork, and he didn't like that one bit. And one day, a Chinese colonel came in and asked him if he could have all the Stearmen that were around there. When Commander Watts said, well, he didn't know. But at Lahore, he went to the embassies, both the British and the American, and it was agreed that the English would give the Stearmans to the Chinese, and the U.S. would then write off their Lend-Lease obligation. So he didn't think it was possible to do that, but to get them there, because then the Chinese colonel says, well, can you get them there? And he says, no, these mountains are 22,000 feet. The Stearman will go 13 to 14 max. It also had a fuel supply of 2 hours, 2 to 2.5 hours. And with a Stearman, you're going to spend all that time climbing up before you get any lateral movement. Because it's not, as I mentioned earlier, it was a training plane. It's not a plane to go up high with at all. He asked about ships. Well, all the ships were full. They were going from the east to the west, carrying home troops, carrying materials. There weren't any going back the other way toward China. Then the colonel, the Chinese colonel, who was not a pilot, said, well, can you fly it? And he didn't think very much about that idea because of these things I was mentioning. But he did, he said anything, he would look into it. The first problem they ran into was maps. There weren't hardly any maps around showing that whole area. He could scrape up under 20 maps, but the Chinese wanted 85 airplanes. But what he figured that he could get all the way over to Burma with all these stops, all of which were about 150 to 200 miles apart, and it was only these last two spots in which they encountered the high altitudes. The other was high, but they were more or less foothills at maybe 10,000 feet or so. So he laid it out, and he thought that he would have flights of 12 daily for a week, and that would get them their 80-plus airplanes. His plan was to have, within each flight, to have 4 small flights of 3 people each. And they would fly in a V. That was the plan, one behind the other. Again, remember, no radios. And all the pilots left in Lahore were Chinese. None of them one could speak English. Well, what he did then was he sent the English pilot with a Stearman to see if he could figure a way to pick through mountain valleys to get these Stearman up to China. This Chinese pilot called himself the best Chinese pilot there was, but it didn't quite turn out that way. But he laid out these various stops, as you see here, and they started out on the 3rd of December, and that was the very latest they could go because the monsoon season was going to start. On their first flight, these 12 planes landed at an air base there in Delhi. And as I say, it didn't start out good because when they landed, there was no fuel available waiting for them. He had arranged that the British would take care of all fuel, lodging, and food while in India, but after India, it was up to the Chinese to get fuel back into here. Now, he didn't quite believe that the Chinese would live up to that, so he did talk a DC-3 crew into carrying 55-gallon drums of fuel into DC-3 into Burma for the first stop, and they would use that, and it's a good thing he did because the Chinese did not furnish the fuel. On the next day on his flight, they were flying into another air base. The three of his planes, him being number one, landed, and then the tower quickly started shooting red flares and red lights. Behind red in flying means stop, quit, abandon what you're doing there. But the remaining 9 Chinese, in a face-saving mood, I guess, continued to on in and land. But the tower had received a note from a Spitfire pilot whose radiator had broken, and he had no more, was running out of water, and very soon his engine would seize. So the tower wanted to call off the other 9 airplanes, but the Chinese wouldn't obey him. And so the Spitfire pilot had to weave in and out of the remaining single-file Stearmans, and they wouldn't give way on the runway, so he had to land in the rough beside the paved runway. And that all turned out okay, so they fueled up and continued on. The next thing that showed up was that when they got out here to the east, when they landed, they were met by what he called a very ragtag group on horses with beards and not much uniform that he thought were bandits, but they turned out to be soldiers hunting for Japanese and Burmese deserters. And they spent that night then in a very cold, elevated gravel strip, and they didn't even ask about the food because they were afraid to know what it was that they were served. But they got through that until the next morning when one commander went out to look at the airplanes, and he noticed in his sight glass, which is a gas gauge basically, about this big in the front seat of the Stearman that hangs under the wing, it had a bottom 2 inches of a brown fluid, which is rusty water. And that's the worst thing that could happen to an airplane engine. It just won't run. So the planes that had been fueled had to be unfueled and refueled. The plan had been to take those 55-gallon drums that were delivered by the DC-3, put them in 5-gallon jerry cans, and then use a funnel with a chamois cloth. Chamois absorbs water, but it's not real fast. The ground crew had previously, amongst themselves, decided, well, what they're going to do, it's much easier if it didn't have that chamois in there, and they took it out and they just put the dirty fuel in the planes. So they had to be unfueled and refueled. And this put them way behind for their last step. They left for, also at that stop, he was to be met by the one scout pilot that was going to find a way through the mountain. But he wasn't there, nor was there a message. So he got new maps, or studied his maps, and he figured out a way that over here in the eastern part of Burma, if he flew out of the way southeast for along a river, flying down the canyon, just off the water, he could then run into another river which was going northeast and could fly up it, more or less skirting all the high ground of the Himalayas. But he still had to get up to 14,000 feet. And these Stearman just, that was super max. But he didn't have any choice. I mean, there was no other way. So because of the fueling problem, he didn't get started till noon. And they flew down the first canyon southeast, and they had to fly single file because they couldn't even fly a V with 3 because it was too narrow. But they flew down in the canyon right above the river, and after about 75 miles to 100, they couldn't find the river going up northeast to get them into China because of the jungle canopy was blocking their vision at that point. They finally found it, turned northeast, flew up the river, single file, but the sun was setting. And because in the mountains, the sun set, well, everywhere it sets to the west, but it was on the back side of the mountains, which made it get dark very early, and it was dusky when they found the gravel strip that was to be their next to last stop before getting to China. And they had to land in complete darkness, but at least the ground crew had set fires to mark out the runway. But they all landed safely of that group of 12, and were putting the airplanes away and getting ready to spend the night when they heard more engines, Stearman engines. And they lit the runway up again, and 8 more Stearman came in, not 12. And the Chinese commander of that group of 12 Stearman had disobeyed and didn't wait till the following day, but he was going to try to squeeze in to get into China early. And it was dark when they were flying that whole river canyon, and 4 of them just disappeared. He didn't know where, when, why, how, or anything, because he was in the front, and it was too dark to go look at anything because they couldn't see anyway. And so 4 Stearman probably ran into the canyon walls. And that is almost the end of the story, because that gave a group of 20 people, 20 pilots, who the next day did fly on to Kunming, China. But while he was in the office at the airport in Kunming, transferring the Stearmans to the Chinese, he came back, and beside all the airplanes except his was a pile of goods. And the Chinese pilots and crew had filled every crack and other space with smuggled goods from India to China, contraband, whether it be guns or clocks or watches or whatever, radios. And he thought, well, I'm glad there are no customs agents, because he would spend the rest of his time in jail. But for the next week, all the other flights arrived intact. So they landed with 81 out of 80,000 people, over 4,000 kilometers long flight over a week's time. And there were quite a few celebrations, and he was awarded the Chinese Award of Cloud and Banner. That was the highest award that China gives. And they gave the same award to General Eisenhower and Lord Mountbatten for other things, but it was the same award. And he was given this award as well for getting them 81 airplanes the very hard way. And Wing Commander Watts stated that he had many awards, but this was the only one he really earned. And so that then brings us to the end, and that's it.
Okay, we're going to have a question and answer session. There's several pilots in here. Would they please stand up? All the pilots in this room, please stand up. Front and center. Okay, look at these pilots. I want to ask every one of them a question. No, don't get down. Don't stand up. Stand back up. Okay. Would you have flown that 4,000 kilometers? 1, 2, 3. Just raise your hand. Who would have flown that? I mean, that is just really a daring event to do that. Not one of these 8 pilots said they'd fly it. So what you just heard was absolutely a miracle. To get a Stearman up to 14,000 feet, these guys wouldn't even do it. And then to fly down that river, that's just absolutely amazing. Okay, you can sit down. The second question, you talked about phosphorus over in Korea. Remember, we had a lot of incendiary bombs made here at Chrysler. And at the end of the war in '46, I think a lot of them were stored out at the 4-H Center, and they lit them all up out there and got rid of all that phosphorus, and you could see that light forever. So the phosphorus they were using over in Korea, what he was talking about from the T-6s. Also the hump, if you remember the hump, we've had a guy talk here, his name's Irv Levine, he's 102 right now, and he was stationed in both Chhabawal, that's in India, as a radio man, radar, and then he went over to Yuming, so he might have been over there when they did that. So he was over in the hump. Ellis Carson is the hump. Carson Center is after his dad named William Carson. And the third one is Miss Dean over here. Her father-in-law is Lloyd Brinker, and he flew what he said a C-46 and C-47 to carry all that gas over to China for all these planes. 80% of the Japanese troops are over in China, and so we had to help the Chinese, or they would have taken over. They'd already taken over all the ports, so that was very important over in that time. Also, you talked about Lend-Lease Act. If you look at Russia, Russia got 8,000 of our planes during World War II because they lost their whole Air Force in 1941. So we put them all from the United States, made them, went to Fairbanks, and then the Russian pod took them all the way to East Russia. They took them apart, put them on a plane, and brought them to the front. And that was 8,000 planes, only 3 P-47s, but all kinds of big planes. And they only had about 200 crashes all across Russia, all across Alaska, and they had to get gas stops. This is a logistical nightmare, what he said with the P-47s. And think of what we did for the Russians in World War II, and that was Lend-Lease Act. Other things he said that I want questions. Stand up and get the questions. So raise your hand if you've got questions. I know we've gone over time, but John Bizal did an excellent talk on, you got a whole flight lesson for him. You might as well be pilots by now. But the Stearman's, when he talked about pilots, you look at the statistics, when Alan Sanderson, I think, got his license, is 1943. 93,000 cadets wanted to be flyboys, okay? How many passed in 1943? He said there's 193,000 pilots in World War II, but in 1943, 93,000 were cadets. Only 10,000 of them passed. So the attrition rate was 90%. Now you go to class, we don't flunk out 90% of our students. They flunked out 9% of those pilots. And a lot of them, I'd like John to tell us how many flunked from the Stearman, but a lot flunked from the Stearman because it's a very difficult plane to fly, but they flunked out from a lot of other reasons. I wouldn't know how to do Morse code, and they had to do that stuff. Okay, now questions for Dr. Bizal. Okay, over there, you gotta stand up, you gotta get a microphone, get over there to him there, Cole, or this gentleman's got a question. Anybody else got questions? Raise your hands, please. And remember, next week, or in the first Thursday of December, it's December 5th, and a pilot's coming down from Indianapolis to talk. So show up at the museum, not here. You won't get any lunch here. Go ahead. Say your name.
Mike, and I was wanting to know how old you were when you finished your basic training, and how old you were when you flew your first airplane.
My basic training was in '57, and I was just got out of college and was paying back my time in ROTC, so I was probably 21, 22. I was born in '35.
And when you talk about 50 years of flying without an accident, you and Bruce, is that the two of you, or who are the two here? That's just an amazing feat. You don't find very many people who got 50 years of flying without issues. I don't think there's many in the state of Indiana. Other questions? We got some more questions here. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bizal. Appreciate it.
Thank you.